Hello, my name is Yair Schiff, and I will be presenting our paper, Simple Guidance Mechanisms for Discrete Diffusion Models. This is joint work with my wonderful lab mates at Cornell and collaborators from Institute. The background of this talk is that recently we have seen a promising challenge to the dominant autoregressive approach to language modeling in the form of discrete diffusion parameterizations. The benefits of diffusion, which iteratively refine entire sequences at each denoising step, is that it can potentially be more amenable to guidance and control mechanisms, as autoregressive models only predict locally one token at a time, and diffusion models predict over the entire sequence at once. And indeed, these guidance mechanisms are at the core of the widespread success of the diffusion models for continuous signals. In this talk, we will show how we can adapt these powerful tools for the recent successful classes of discrete diffusion models as well. As a brief note on notation, throughout I will use S and T to denote time steps in the diffusion process, which goes from signal at time 0 to noise at time 1. S will be less than T. Intermediate latent variables are represented by the boldface Z variables and subscripted by time. For discrete sequences of L tokens, we use the superscript to denote the dimension or token. We begin with some background on guidance and how it is implemented in the continuous domain. To make things concrete, we state that the goal of control generation is that samples be drawn from the following conditional and tempered distribution. Using Bayes' rule, we see that the conditional distribution is proportional to sampling from the product of an unconditional denoising distribution, i.e. the second term on the right, and a class probability given noisy latent vectors. We can tune this distribution using a temperature parameter, gamma, that controls how closely we focus in on the class condition. For continuous signals, we employ hill climbing using the score function, or the gradient of the log probability with respect to the inputs. Using this tool, the normalization constant disappears in the bottom expression of the slide. And thus, for classifier-based guidance, the algorithm entails taking steps along the direction of the score of the unconditional denoising diffusion model and an external classifier trained on noisy inputs. Applying Bayes' rule again for the first term and plugging it into the expression, we get a formulation that no longer needs access to an externally trained classifier. This yields an algorithm of classifier-free guidance where we now follow a weighted score from a conditional diffusion model and an unconditional one. In practice, these models are trained jointly by randomly dropping out the conditioning variable during training to model the unconditional distribution. We now move to the derivation of comparable mechanisms for discrete diffusion models. Unfortunately, we are stymied before even getting out of the gate, because for discrete signals, the central quantity of the score function is undefined. Therefore, we need to take a step back and find a different formulation. We return to the original distribution from which we want to sample, and we find a way to manipulate it in order to get good guidance algorithms. To preview the results somewhat, what we will end up with is that the sample from the tempered conditional distribution, we will do so by taking samples that are proportional to a rescaling of the original unconditional discrete denoising diffusion model, scaled by something appropriate. Here, we start first with the classifier-free guidance, unlike in the continuous domain, because the derivation is more straightforward. As before, applying Bayes' rule to the first term gets rid of the dependence on an external classifier, and the last term that appears can be simply absorbed into the constant. This yields a formulation for discrete classifier-free guidance where we sample proportional to a weighted average of a conditional and an unconditional discrete denoising model. Moving to discrete classifier-based guidance, we might think that we can simply begin sampling proportional to the original tempered distribution we presented. However, normalizing this distribution is intractable. While so far we have not made a point of explicitly depicting the dimensionality of sequence length of the data, because all the distributions were assumed to factorize independently along the sequence length dimension, for discrete classifier-based guidance we cannot ignore this. Specifically, the classifier term may not factorize independently along the sequence length dimension, and therefore normalizing it would require evaluating the probability for every possible denoising sequence Z sub S, of which there are exponentially many. Therefore, we need to first apply an additional assumption. Namely, we begin by assuming that the conditional tempered distribution factorizes independently, which lets us model the probability of each denoised token in a sequence. Returning now to our equation, we get a tractable probability distribution, since we only need to evaluate the normalization constant for each possible value from the vocabulary that this individual token can take on. As before, the unconditional term we model with the discrete diffusion model. And for the first term, we model it with a classifier trained on noisy sequences as above. However, here we only evaluate it on sequences that differ only at the position lowercase l that we are generating. Putting this together, we now have tractable and easy to implement algorithms for guidance in discrete domains. Before covering experimental results, we take a brief detour to cover another contribution of our work. We stress that the recent successful discrete diffusion models rely on absorbing or masking state processes. However, an important limitation of these models is that they cannot change generated tokens. The reason is that the forward process is absorbing, and so if a token becomes masked, it can never leave that state. Therefore, the true and approximate reverse processes reflect this by ensuring that any unmasked tokens at some time t remain unmasked at less noisy time steps s, since the token could never have been masked at s if it was unmasked at time t. This leads us to revisit other limiting distributions from discrete diffusion, such as the uniform distribution, which moves all the mass from the signal to the equal probability of a token being chosen at random from the vocabulary. This discrete diffusion process has previously been explored in other works, but has always been found to lag behind the modeling capabilities of absorbing state models. In this work, we challenge that finding by refining the variational lower bound for uniform noise discrete diffusion by taking their continuous time limits. Importantly, for uniform noise processes, tokens can change throughout the generation. We therefore hypothesize that this makes these models more amenable to the guidance mechanisms we just derived. Moving to the experimental results, as noted, we find that contrary to prior work, a continuous time uniform model trained with our objective and parameterization, which we call UDLM, can rival and even outperform comparable absorbing state models. This holds especially true in smaller vocabulary regimes that are typical of scientific applications. And we also find that our UDLM models are state-of-the-art among previously proposed uniform noise diffusion models. Looking at one of the guidance results from our work, we find that indeed combining our proposed discrete guidance mechanisms with diffusion models leads to improved results that push the Pareto frontier of the sample quality versus conditional generation trade-off compared to AR models. Please check out our paper and open source code for more details. Thank you for your time and attention. Please stop by our poster session to discuss more.